One, two, 1, 2, 3, 4.
Hey everybody, it's Sam Jacobs, and welcome to the Sales Hacker Podcast. If my math is correct, I think this should be 2019 that you're listening to this, and if so, I hope you had a Happy New Year, and if it's still 2018, then fantastic. I hope you're looking forward to 2019. I don't know what to tell you. This week, we've got a great show. We've got Diane Chang, who is leading enterprise growth for the East Coast for Workplace by Facebook, which is their enterprise collaboration tool that is nestled within the broader Facebook consumer organization. So it's a really interesting story about how to build a startup within this big corporate entity that is focused on a totally different market, which is the consumer world. And Diane's got an incredible background. She was in strategic partnerships at Google before she was at Facebook, and she's had a bunch of different roles. So she talks about sort of how to take advantage of your career, how to navigate your career, and how to make sure that when there's an opportunity, sort of lean in and seize the day and raise your hand for that opportunity. So it's a great conversation, and she sort of walks through her personal philosophies, including having a protagonist framework, which is really interesting. So listen on for that. Before we dive in, we want to thank our sponsors. The first is AirCall, a phone system designed for the modern sales team. AirCall seamlessly integrates into your CRM, eliminating data entry for your reps and providing you with greater visibility into your team's performance through advanced reporting. When it's time to scale, you can add new lines and minutes and use in-call coaching to reduce ramp time for your new reps. Visit aircall.io/saleshacker to see why a million great companies are using AirCall. Our second sponsor is Outreach. That's outreach.io, the leading sales engagement platform. Outreach triples the productivity of sales teams and empowers them to drive predictable and measurable revenue growth by prioritizing the right activities and scaling customer engagement with intelligent automation. Outreach makes customer-facing teams more effective and improves visibility into what really drives results. So go over to outreach.io/saleshacker. That is outreach.io/saleshacker to see how thousands of customers, including Cloudera, Glassdoor, Pandora, Zillow, and on and on and on, rely on Outreach to deliver higher revenue per sales rep. Lastly, as many of you know, I am part of a global advocacy organization for commercial executives called the Revenue Collective. We are now in Toronto, Denver, Boston, London, New York, and I'm probably forgetting one, Amsterdam, where Andre Bressel, the COO of Hotel Champ, started that chapter. But if you're in a different market somewhere out there and you're interested in starting up a Revenue Collective chapter, drop me a line. You can reach me at linkedin.com/in/SamFJacobs. So that's a little announcement for the Revenue Collective. Now, without further ado, let's listen to Diane Chang from Facebook in this week's episode of the Sales Hacker Podcast. Hey everybody, it's Sam Jacobs. Welcome back to the Sales Hacker Podcast. We are incredibly excited. If I've done my math right, it is now 2019. And if it's not 2019, I hope you're having a good 2018, but it should be 2019. But that's not the point. The point is that we're really excited for this week's guest. She is a member of the Revenue Collective, but more importantly, Diane Chang is the enterprise growth lead for Workplace by Facebook. So in her role, she leads Workplace's commercial presence on the East Coast. She's going to tell us all about Workplace. If you're not familiar with it, it is their enterprise software solution, obviously for enterprises. And she's building a go-to-market sales team that looks a lot like and is B2B enterprise sales within the construct of the global Facebook organization. So it's going to be a super interesting conversation. Prior to this role, she was the chief of staff for Nicola Mendelsohn, Facebook's VP of EMEA. Earlier in her career, she spent a number of years at Google leading strategic partnerships with top e-commerce companies in the UK. And she holds a BA from Princeton and an MBA from Harvard Business School, so she's smart. Diane, welcome to the show.
Great. Thanks so much for having me, Sam.
We are excited to have you. So let's just dive into it. So for the listeners out there, Facebook is a public company. Normally we would go into Diane's baseball card and we'd ask about ARR and all of those financial metrics that private companies have. But we can all look up Facebook's 10K if we want to know about how big they are and what they're up to. So let's hear about you. Diane, first of all, tell us what is enterprise. Tell us about Workplace for Facebook or Workplace by Facebook, and give us a little bit about of the origin story, because I think it's really interesting.
Yeah, of course. Okay, so Workplace by Facebook. And in a quick soundbite, you can think of it as a private Facebook for the organization. And it actually started as an internal tool. So basically, in 2011, Mark Zuckerberg gets up on stage at F8 and he talks about, think back to a time where Facebook did not have groups, and we would announce that as a feature. So it was a place for friends and family to get together. And at the time, the organization Facebook had grown so quickly that it actually felt while we were on stage talking about new innovative features and the new type of company that Facebook was, actually internally we had grown so quickly that things were locked in silos. So emails, meetings, etc. So one enterprising engineer basically took groups and made it available for just Facebook, the organization. And it actually kind of changed everything overnight. And so when we think about as the organization grew, the most important thing is that people have access to information so they can make the best decisions. It's literally not the people that are just in the meeting rooms or on the senior email threads that are making the decisions. And so it was a very deliberate management decision since 2011 to actually make what we called Facebook at Work a thing. And then along the way, we got a lot of questions from people who would ask about, how has Facebook brought people along in the journey as it's grown so quickly? And we realized, in some ways, we used Facebook to make Facebook Facebook. So we took it. A lot of, I think, companies are like that, right? In some instances, if you look at Aaron Ross, he'll say Salesforce made Salesforce Salesforce. So in this instance, it feels very relevant. And so in 2015, we made it available in beta. And our first paying customer was the Royal Bank of Scotland, who's in a totally opposite business than Facebook. But they had basically invested a lot in external advocacy after the financial crisis and wanted to do more for their employee base. And so it's grown from there. We renamed it to Workplace in 2016. Facebook at Work was very confusing for the external market. And now we've got 30,000 organizations using it, from Walmart, Starbucks, Delta to the 10-person nail salon that's around the corner.
Wow. And you're running that. Are you allowed to tell us how big your team is?
Yes. And so in New York, and we actually have a landing team in New York. So we just put people here a year ago. And so we've got 3 in sales, 2 in customer success, and 1 solutions architect. And so it's just a straight up pod function. But Workplace, interestingly, is the first product of Facebook to be fully built outside of Menlo Park. And so again, because it was like an internal side project, there were a couple of engineers working on it in London. And it's now grown to an organization of maybe 100, 150 people on the commercial side, and that as well as on the product.
Wow. Awesome. Well, I want to sort of deeply dig in, but let's start with you. And how did you get to this role? We heard in your bio that you went to Princeton and HBS, but how did you find your way to Facebook in the first place? Give us a little bit about your background.
Sure. It's a good question. And so, I think generally my foray into tech started in a place that you wouldn't necessarily expect. And that actually was because I started my career in fashion. And for all the amazing things that fashion brings, I think my vantage and entry point into it made me feel like actually I wanted to work on something with true scale. And so if you wanted scale, I went to somewhere where I got it, and that was Google. And I think from there, I basically got hooked and completely spoiled on what it meant for, a thought, a product, a project to have such impact for people's daily lives. And so through there, I had a variety of different partnerships roles that took me to London, Mountain View, et cetera. And then my journey to actually Facebook was just a continuation of that continual, I think, hunt for impact and scale. But the interesting thing, I think, while I'd done a lot of partnerships role, having done that, I actually ended up taking a chief of staff role in London for our VP of EMEA, which is Europe, Middle East, and Africa. It's quite a corporate distinction to call it EMEA. And that basically gave me exposure to kind of the whole business in a way that probably would, that it would take some time for me to see other vantage points of the business. So I'm thinking about comms, policy, areas of the business that didn't necessarily work around just the core silo that I was in. And I think the interesting thing about that is you would imagine, okay, when people talk to leaders of Facebook, they could ask anything, right? They could ask anything from how does Facebook feel about XYZ policy to what are you doing on ABC product? But the single biggest thing that people wanted to ask and talk about was Facebook's culture. How have you scaled it? People would always say things about, actually, it really feels like I'm trying to get my messages out, and how does Facebook do it? And interestingly, so much of that conversation just came back to Workplace. And so I felt like it was coming up in so many conversations that when it was time to look for my next role, along with a personal move to New York, it seemed pretty clear cut to me that I was really excited to build out what Workplace could be for the East Coast.
And you're in a sales leadership role. And I think, so your commercial roles before had been running sort of partnerships teams. Are you noticing a difference? Does it feel completely natural? How are you approaching sort of this new set of responsibilities?
So I think some things do feel completely natural. And I think this may be both, learned at the knee of my previous boss and then a broad Facebook thing of just people are people, right? So whether you're selling someone on the opposite side or you're building a partnership, fundamentally, what you're trying to do is have a thought, have a vision, guide and educate and then get to that piece. I think what will feel slightly different are a couple of the things of just like the rigor of what is a B2B sale versus how I thought about partnerships in the past. And I've worked on, on revenue partnerships previously, but it feels completely different, I think, in this aspect of how we think about it. And I think when you talk to sales leaders who are doing B2B software sales in particular, I've completely marveled at the discipline and the pantheon of knowledge that exists in these sales leaders of just how similar the issues are, right? You could be a sales leader for 25 years and you could be a sales leader for 6 months, and you're still kind of fundamentally figuring out, okay, where is the line between our sales and marketing team? How do we get them to work together? How do you think about your demand gen? How do you think about sales cycle optimization? And so I love that because I think I've found it a very welcoming and incredible community of such smart, switched on, sometimes very high decibel leaders that are so willing to talk about anything from the most entry level to the most advanced. And so I think that's been some of the biggest challenge and then also some of the biggest surprise.
So how are you? I mean, it's super interesting, first of all, just scaling the culture and obviously share what you're comfortable sharing. But how do you introduce or be part of the team that is introducing, I guess, it's 2016. It sounds like when things, got into beta, but still a relatively new effort to introduce the concept of traditional B2B sales inside this global consumer organization. How do you do that? What's your strategy for doing that? And what's the timeline for you to feel like you're making the right impact? I guess if you guys have 30,000 different organizations using it, you've already made an impact, but how do you think about it?
Yeah, so I think we feel really lucky because people always ask why is Facebook in this space? Like, it wouldn't naturally have to go into the enterprise space. And for us, actually, if you think about it, like Facebook changed its mission last year to be centered around giving people the power to build community and bring the world closer together. And so actually, if you think about like your most arguably, maybe not your most important community, but for many people, their most important community and the one that you spend the most time with, it is your work. And so for us, we feel like Workplace is a fundamentally important way to bring people into communities in their workplace. And so I think from there, we feel very lucky within the larger Facebook ecosystem that this is a huge bet and investment for Facebook. And so if you look at our 3, 5, 10-year roadmap as we talk about our products, we're in the same company as Instagram and Messenger. So for the Workplace team, we feel really proud about that and think that's really good company. But that said, again, I mean, if you're working on consumer businesses, it's so easy for Instagram and Messenger to tout their huge user counts or monthly active people. And for Workplace, it will feel somewhat different because we're in a different stage of the business. But that said, I think it comes with both strengths and then things that are areas to develop on. So I think the great part about it is with Facebook's consumer DNA, the whole point is like what we care about is getting people to use the product. So I think while there are more traditional benchmarks and milestones as you think about building enterprise business, we still take that lens to what it means about Workplace. And it just means that all we want to do is build great products that people want to use. And then if you go in and you talk to people who have been in the enterprise collaboration software space and have potentially invested in previous ones, all they will do and tell you, whether they're HR, IT, comms, pick your persona, is that like, we bought something, it seemed great, it ticked every box on the matrix, and yet people don't use it. So I think we feel really lucky because we at least have a track record of building products that people use. On the opposite side, I mean, the funny thing is what it means to build an enterprise organization within a large consumer organization is just some of the milestones of what that means. So for example, we were building an SDR function, and it wasn't one that was familiar to Facebook until basically you built an enterprise sales organization. So going through that concept of what does an organization look like and what are the things actually that we need as a baseline. And then, some of the other things of just like how we think about our lead gen and demand gen will be very different from some of the other areas of Facebook's business. So that's something that we've also had to explore and strike the right balance.
Is your lead gen, is it sort of this concept of product qualified leads? I mean, is it a freemium platform? Tell us a little bit more about like the product itself. And I guess my question is, does it compete? I mean, is it a Slack competitor? Is it a Yammer competitor? How do we sort of fit it into, the right category?
Yeah, of course. It's a great question. And even I think the enterprise collaboration space, if you were to Google like enterprise collaboration space, you'll get 15 different articles, which will tell you either like it's Slack or it's Yammer or it's Chatter or it's Jive. But fundamentally, actually, we think our biggest competition is email. And that sounds kind of like, okay, what does that actually mean? But I mean, guarantee everyone who is collaborating in a company is sending communications on email. It is the most most like entrenched technology you can think of. And so for us, actually, we think there's a huge opportunity to start even with something as simple of revolutionizing top-down collaboration, because most of that is still done via email. Your CEO or your senior leader will send an email to 100, 250, 200,000 people. And unless you were the intern that missed the memo, you do not reply all to that email. And all that means is that you don't actually get two-way conversation in an organization. Whereas if you put it in something that's a little bit more familiar, which by definition, there's a blank that says reply, write a comment, like you're asking for feedback, and it's not so scary to reply back to your CEO when he posts it or when he goes live or uses something that's like actually how people communicate in 2019. And so I think that's kind of where we think we play. And there's a lot of people who have tried other things. So some of the names that you've mentioned obviously are great products. But I think what we have found is that there's an incredible adoption across an entire organization. And so back to the idea of making a company into a community, this not only takes your tech team or your accounting team or your HR team, but the whole goal is really to bring everyone in. And to your question on business models, so we have two options. We have both standard, which is free, and then premium. But most people, I think, opt for premium just because it comes with some controls, like, for an admin panel, for example. So anything, I think, above a 10-person organization would want that. And our pricing model is like $3 per monthly active person. So again, we charge on an active usage rather than seats. And that's another example, I think, of what we were talking about. If we really care, we want people to use the product rather than thinking about what more traditional pricing options.
When you think about like the ROI, and I guess I'm just super interested in, I'm always interested in the concept of like building these B2B enterprise businesses within like a broader ecosystem, like a broader consumer business like Facebook. So do you guys have like your own marketing team when you're thinking about ROI? Has it been a struggle to sort of develop all of the right traditional enterprise sales collateral to help the sales team be effective?
Yeah, and I think for us, it's still very much a work in progress. And even thinking through like what it means for a product to be headquartered in London and built out of London. So that means that those were our first sales cycles, right? So what sells in the enterprise collaboration space in EMEA may be different than in APAC, may be different in North America and LATAM. So I think that's definitely something we're still learning. So for example, culture may resonate with a certain set of CEOs, but others will find that fluffy, and like what they actually want to measure is impact to their bottom line. And so if I think about our marketing team, for example, I think they've done an incredible job of just getting Workplace out there and still figuring out how we tell our enterprise story and what we're leading with. Because I think back trying to explain what Facebook was when you were like first on it and you ask your friend to get on it and you're like, it's photos, but it's news feed and et cetera. And I think for us, what we're doing is really trying to crystallize actually what this could be, which is it's both feature rich, but also very targeted in what we want to do for an organization. But sometimes, I think trying to distill that in a 10 copy display ad can be tricky. And so we're still working through that, but it's, I think, a good problem to have.
What kind of salespeople have you found to be effective? And, it's a common question across all sales leadership, but when you think about the ideal profile, what are the qualities for this specific type of sales motion that have emerged as sort of determinant of success?
Yeah, it's interesting. So I think also, Workplace has gone through an interesting evolution as we started in the market. Obviously, you have the name recognition from the parent brand, but not a lot of other people, I think, understood what it was. And again, we took it to market with like Facebook at Work. So I think in the earlier stages, you really needed somebody who could like sell the vision, right? What this could be. It's a new way of running a company and a lot of the pieces around that. And so kind of the classic, like I hate to use the Jeffrey Moore type methodology, but it like 100% applies, right? Are you getting charismatic business leaders who can see what this is? And then as the sales cycle goes on, then people have more questions, right? Then you're dealing with a Fortune 2000 IT company. And then I think we feel really excited about the progress and how we've met that challenge. And so some of our recent customers we've announced are AstraZeneca, Vodafone, GlaxoSmithKline. And so as you get into those industries, you imagine that they have the most rigorous checks in the world of what they want to accomplish, ROI, security, et cetera. And we've been able to make that happen. And so I think from a broader perspective, that evolution has then meant you need salespeople who are very just basically adaptable, right? Who can actually sell a vision and tell that story and lay that as the baseline, but then also be proficient enough to talk through what it actually means for a security check. And I think probably the second piece we're finding to be really successful is somebody who can say okay, I'm going to tell you, this is how we think about collaboration at Facebook. And this is what we've learned from our base of customers about how collaboration and communication are happening in the enterprise today, what it will look like in 2 years and 5 years. And you may not be ready to figure out how that's going to work in your organization, but I'm going to tell you how. These are the people that you need to go galvanize. This is the story that you need to tell. Here are the common questions you're going to get. And so it really is this kind of guiding educational piece, I think, of salespeople who aren't afraid to say, actually, like, I fully hear you and I disagree, but because I care enough about your organization and the future of it to tell you. And so that's, I think, what we've seen transfer the most successfully to a workplace skill set.
So that's almost like a challenger methodology, leading with commercial insight and talking to customers about sort of their business and presenting it in a new way.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like to me. So when you've been at Google and you've been at Facebook, and I think there's probably a lot of people out there who are either at high growth companies or maybe some of them are at big companies and trying to figure out how do they become you and like how do they navigate these organizations effectively and continue moving up the ladder. When you think about what's made you successful at Google and Facebook, these two huge companies that are driving sort of the technical evolution of the world, what do you attribute it to? What are the skills that you think you've relied on that have really helped you? Like how does somebody else sort of follow in your footsteps?
Wow, what a nice question. I think some of the things that I don't think it's like one thing in particular, right? And everyone will kind of always classically say, like, what's the difference between like hard work or lucky break? And I think kind of classically people will say, well, it's the hard work that gets you to your lucky break. And for me, I do feel very lucky. I've had a lot of great opportunities along the way in between these different organizations. But I'd say if there were a couple of things that I'd pinpoint. So one is really just like if you see something and you're interested in it, like don't be afraid to go have the conversation or ask a question. And I think you'd be surprised by how many people just don't do that. That being just like the literal table stakes of step one. And so, for example, like at Google, when I wanted to do strategic partnerships, basically everyone told me I was way too junior to go do it, right? I had, Google had just signed an agreement with Apple to put Google Maps on the launch of the Apple iPhone. And this is literally 2007. And I was like, that's cool. Who signs that agreement? Who pays whom, et cetera, et cetera. And then, everyone was like, well, it's this very like fancy strategic partnerships team. But again, you're going to need like 10 more years experience. So if you want to go do partnerships, like quit Google, go to a smaller company that'll allow you to do partnerships. I was like, okay, well, that sounds like a pretty drastic move. And so then you basically just find someone on the team and it's, Google, like, are you happy to have a 30-minute chat? And most people were ready to have a 30-minute chat, which led to a 6-month maternity cover on that team, which led to a full-time role. But I've like seen that time and time again. And even if I look at roles, like even for hiring my replacement for a chief of staff role, a lot of people basically just didn't like go for the role because they were like, they thought, oh, I'm not sure I'm ready for it or et cetera. But like that you already like put yourself out of the running to begin with. And I think I felt really surprised seeing that cycle happen. And so I'd say the biggest thing I would say is literally just like, there's nothing wrong to go have the 30-minute conversation. There's literally zero downside to it.
And then you mentioned a few lessons. What are some of the other? So one of them is like raise your hand and sort of jump at the opportunity. And but what else do you think? Are there other sort of management skills? And I guess one of the other questions is how do you go from being an individual contributor to a manager? And what are your thoughts on sort of what is representative of a great manager? This is kind of all over the place, but I'm specifically interested in that.
Yeah, but we're going to get through this. This is going to be like a good management book that we're going to finish.
I hope so.
So I think, so a couple of things. I think back to the kind of first question of other things I think that are important to remember. I think you don't necessarily have to have a steer on like what your 15-year plan is, but have a sense of like what your next is after your next. And so again, that doesn't mean like you have fully figured out what you're going to be when you grow up. But if you know that, like, so for example, if you wanted to be a manager at some point, then start to figure out like, okay, well then maybe if not my next role, then what would allow me to be a manager in my next one? And of course, there's a lot of soul searching conversations that go alongside with that of like, do you want to be a manager? Do you care about investing in teams and other people's development and influencing to produce outcomes? But at least you've done some of that thought work. And I actually found it like pretty surprising, even in inflection points where, so for example, like classic like business school application essays, which you would imagine are pretty like stock and barrel, but they actually ask you what sound like very trite questions, like, what do you want, like what drives you and why? But actually if you like take a step back and whether you're applying to school or not, it like actually just think like, okay, like what actually is the 5th level answer to that question. Not the first one or the second one, but if like my best friend were to keep asking me why, like, why do I actually want to do something? And if you can get to that point where you have like a pretty good answer, maybe every 5 or 10 years, I think that's a pretty good guiding North Star. So you don't end up in like some industry and function that has nothing to do with what you would actually have drawn for yourself. And so I think I've like done that a couple of times and just had the discipline to do it, because it is a discipline and it is a process, in the same way where you easily could get distracted by your day-to-day, to the busyness of work, the busyness of personal life, et cetera, to make that happen.
Well, let me interject real quick. So why do you, what is your, I mean, this is really important, because I think there's so many people out there listening that they're trying to figure out what is, I mean, I hate to sound cliche, but what is their why? So when you've done that every couple of years, like what's the most recent, I mean, if you're comfortable sharing, it's probably pretty personal, but like what does motivate you? What does propel you forward?
No, of course. And so I think for me, actually, when I did like the list, and some of this is like the little, like the practical tips on it, are like write down like 5 moments where you felt like, man, I like accomplished that. And I was the only, like, this is, I think I accomplished it in a way that nobody else would have, because I cared about something that somebody else wouldn't have. And that can be both personal and professional. And so I think what I cared about and doing that, like it was literally everything from things at work where I had like stayed longer on a project and everyone else is like, let's just give up, this is stupid. And I'm like, no, I really care about this, to even personal things where I'm like, I went above and beyond on that. Like, so for example, like planning a trip. And I'm like, okay, well, what's the common thread between these things? And if I actually like think about it, I actually like really care about like, I think creating the experiences and like the stories that people hear and have. And I think that continually has been a thing that's led me through. I mean, I've loved in every single role when I've been able to like latch on to what is a vision. And I think that's what drives me about the workplace, of like, there is a vision of what work could be. And I really care about like people understanding that, having that experience, go through that with me, even if like, 6 months into it, they're going to be like, actually, no, like, we may have signed an agreement 12 months ago with a previous provider. I'm like, I really care about you having the experience where your work is fundamentally better. And so I think that's been true, I think, throughout my whole career, of like thinking through like, what is an experience that you think people should have and how can you help them have that?
Wow. That's really, really powerful stuff. So, and that's kind of propelled you the whole way. I mean, I interrupted you before, but so tell us what else, like you're taking stock, you're sort of pushing forward, and you're thinking about like what motivates you. What else, what other lessons do you have for people as they think about sort of pursuing? And I guess one of the other ones that you just mentioned is, raising your hand and making sure that you lean in on the opportunity, and probably like maybe tackling things that you feel you might not be completely ready for. Does that sound accurate?
Yeah, definitely. And I think maybe the last one is like just having like, as somewhat contrary from what I was just saying, of like have an idea of what your next is after your next. But I think I feel really lucky to have had international experience for a big chunk in my career. So I worked in London for before and after business school, so 7 years in total. And I think what that was incredible about that is it just basically like reorients yourself around a completely different geographic axis. And then just the idea that like your inputs are going to come from different places. And if you assume that your inputs are always going to come from like one straight path, that's not actually true. And so I think just putting yourself in a position where you seek out, and that doesn't have to necessarily mean geography, but just where you think you'll get to a point where you get enough interdisciplinary inputs. I mean, basically every great like leader and thinker and invention out there has been because like somebody has seen things that haven't been seen before, and putting yourself in a position where you are exposed to new things like naturally does that for you. So I'd say that's kind of the third part of my management how to be successful treatise.
Well, I mean, people are listening, so I think it's helpful. One of the things that you've talked to me about is sort of this concept of like the protagonist mindset. So tell us what that is and walk us through that framework.
Yeah, so this one I have to credit to a thinker and a leader named Fred Kaufman, who wrote a book called Conscious Business. And within Conscious Business, he introduces this framework of basically like the protagonist mindset, right? So this is like the classic, okay, somebody's late to a meeting in the morning, and you ask them like, oh, or they rush in, they're like, coffee spilled on them, and then you're like, what's up? And they're like, oh, there was terrible traffic. And so the protagonist basically is like to flip that mindset and say like, actually, I know there's traffic every single day and I'm late because I didn't leave enough room. Now, on the one hand, that can sound like totally like, man, this is like a hard framework on one, because then you're always basically taking responsibility. But the idea is that there is a spectrum, right, between a protagonist and a victim. And the victim is the one that's like, I couldn't do anything, there was traffic. And the protagonist is like, I didn't leave enough time. So in the future, I know that I have agency to leave another 10 minutes. And how does that translate across, everything, right? Both personal and professional. And so in an interaction with, a close friend, like what does it mean to actually like take ownership of that? And then certainly, I mean, you'll know this better than anyone, but building feeling like in a startup environment, there's like going to be crazy things that happen to you. And sometimes you will have to acknowledge that, look, maybe the structure wasn't right. This wasn't set up for success. We should have thought about that 6 months ago. But it all kind of like stems around, do you have like the even the first sliver of light to be able to say, actually, I take responsibility for that. Like I should have done X, even if it's like, I should have thought about that 6 months ago, 12 months ago, and I didn't. So the only thing that prevents you from, like, just means that you probably will think about it when you come to that similar situation in the future. So within the workplace team, I think it's very interesting. Within North America, again, usually in North America, you have the very luxurious position of your product team sitting in likely in California or pretty close to you. And again, I think for the workplace team, it's a very good experience for all of us that our London is our product team and our commercial headquarters. So it stretches a lot of skills on like what that means to be in touch with your product team, getting feedback, and just the additional work it takes to make sure communication is working. But alongside with that, it means also in North America, we've been really focused on adopting a protagonist mindset, meaning like just in case you feel like that product feedback didn't get back, like it's, one thing to be like, well, I sent the email. It's another thing to be like, I didn't hear back and I didn't follow up. And so I think that's something that we've really had to take to heart, and also key for basically just a small team that can feel far away from a commercial and product headquarters.
Do you guys have like a different hiring methodology, or like, are you looking for different types of people for Workplace by Facebook than the broader Facebook consumer organization? And does that impact, how does that impact you, if at all?
I wouldn't say that it's different. Certainly I think there are core skills. So for, some of the conversation we've been having around having an enterprise background that is going to be much more helpful to you selling Workplace rather than maybe potential other sales skill sets. But that said, I think, Facebook broadly, and this will always be kind of like the first filter of what does it mean to succeed at Facebook. And I think there will be things of, being able to work cross-functionally, right? I think this is an organization, like many matrix organizations, where a lot of your success is built on like how quickly you can build relationships and understand that like your success doesn't happen just by yourself, which there are other organizations where that actually does happen, but that's something that really won't work at Facebook, and just given our history and the way that we've grown. And so that's, I think, a key one that we think about when we bring people into the organization. I think the second one, and classically everyone will tell you adaptability, but again, I think that also applies to how we think about Workplace. And interestingly, a lot of the people who started the Workplace team were longtime Facebookers and hadn't sold enterprise software before, but the reason they were successful is they could tell you basically what the vision of like, this is how we think we should run a company, right? In some instance, we were talking a little bit about how we thought about culture. And then obviously as the product expanded, then we see how this manifests at other people's organizations. So have those stories to feed in. And now it's a much richer conversation about what culture, what employee engagement, et cetera, looks like now. But that said, you kind of need to be able to like adapt to that change. And I think, every time you're starting a new business within Facebook, you want to bring in that Facebook DNA and then obviously, subject matter expertise.
How did you guys think about bringing in, enterprise sales expertise into this new business unit? Did you hire a bunch of consultants? Did you read a bunch of books? What did you guys embrace a specific sales methodology? Tell us a little bit about that evolution.
Yeah, so I don't know if we settled on a particular sales methodology, and then certainly the book reading. My entire team laughs basically because it feels like I'm Amazon's best customer every single day. But I think every salesperson at this point, we haven't like settled on one, and so is basically just working on what works for them. And we kind of have a joke, so we have a sales leader who leads our EMEA region, and he is like an incredibly charismatic but also very forceful person, and he can say stuff that I would never be able to get away with in a sales pitch. So he'll like get in there, like start the pitch and just say, it's too late, you're already too late, and people will pause and be like, what are you talking about? Yes, and he says in like an amazing conversation in an amazing French accent, and he's like, your people are already communicating on WhatsApp, they're already on consumer Facebook, they're already out there with your enterprise data, you've completely missed it. Okay, like think about me saying that, like that would never happen. It would just never be like my personality, my pitch, but it's very effective when he says it. Everyone's always like, oh my God, I'm too late. And so I would love to find that spin for me, whereas I'm going in talking about like, the vision of a company and what it will be. But so I think all that is to say, we're not yet there. There's a lot of room for personality and how people approach it. But I think, as obviously the organization grows up, we will standardize it and bring in kind of core enablement functions so that it doesn't feel like if you're brand new and you aren't a natural, you're too late type of person, that is you're not, you have some other tools to fall back upon. And if
do you guys use like CRM? Do you use Salesforce or some kind of CRM? Are you adopting and embracing other elements of like traditional SaaS B2B sales, or is it a lot of like still homegrown Facebook tools to sort of go to market?
Oh, no, in that regard, I mean, I think we use Salesforce, and we were using Salesforce even when it wasn't an enterprise business. And so that as a baseline, and, we're a happy customer of SalesLoft. And so there's a lot of other things I think that we're bringing into the organization and still exploring. Again, I think, we're on a path to kind of figure out how do we make everyone most efficient. And like, as we think about it, like the team is pretty lean if you think about it. So like I said, it's basically 3 salespeople for a total team of 7 with customer success and solutions architect for the East Coast region. And so a lot of that will scale through service partners and a partner ecosystem. And that is a muscle that in some ways we know because Facebook has a lot of partnership DNA. But that said, also like, figuring out in the enterprise space is new as well. And then the other thing, we've brought in incredible leaders. And so the person who leads our global sales organization now is Leslie Young, who came to us from Box. And I think it's been incredible what she's built within the organization and the change and impact she's been able to kind of mold with Workplace. And so it's I think a perfect marriage of enterprise history and excellence and what a best-in-class organization should look like, plus that Facebook like history and DNA and just like the craziness of Facebook in general.
One of the you sort of alluded to it a little bit before when you're talking about sort of one of the things that impacted your career is you said if there's an opportunity to make sure you raise your hand and go for it. And of course, like the first 2 words that jump to my mind at least are lean in and, that famous book. And you are a female sales leader, obviously. Any advice or has that affected you? I mean, obviously gender affects all of us every single day and just in ways that are conscious and unconscious, but have you developed your own personal strategy for navigating the workplace? Have you felt like it's impacted you at all? What advice would you give to young women that are rising up through the ranks? Just always curious. We live in, a changing time and we want to make sure that we're arming everybody with the tools they need to be successful in their careers. What's your perspective on that?
Yeah, of course. And so I think my perspective on this has kind of changed over time. I think, earlier in my career, I was thinking actually like it shouldn't matter, right? Somebody is up for a job who is up for a job. And if you're not, you should be able to put your hand up. It should be easy and et cetera. And I think over time, actually, and spending more time and thinking a lot about it, and then certainly I think working for incredible female leaders has given me even more vantage point on that actually it's not just like, you should just raise your hand and all else follows, despite the fact that I just literally gave you that advice. So I'm acknowledging that. But on top of that, I think actually what it is there's a couple of things that I think go into it. One, I think is just the acknowledgement that it is important for female leaders and people who are female to like actually think about what they want things to look like and then just go for them, right? And so I think maybe it just takes some like being actually planful to make sure that the natural circumstances don't end up just meaning that somebody isn't in a place where they want to be. And so I think maybe for me, it has been about actually taking just a little bit more thought to make sure that like the default doesn't happen, so to speak. And second things I would be about like actually just finding like people within the organization that don't necessarily need to be like your quote unquote mentor, but people who have like qualities that you admire. And then basically just go like study those qualities and then like see what that actually manifests as, right? So if you have a North Star for, okay, fine, I know that this particular leader, like I'm sure that she might handle XYZ situation in a certain way, then actually then that's your rubric and roadmap. And so I think that kind of modeling is really helpful, even if it doesn't have to be as personal as like a mentorship or a one-on-one conversation. And then the third thing I'd say is like actually just like find your like literal people in the workplace that you feel are like your kindred spirits. And that doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be of the same gender, but people who you think kind of like get how you think and like that you can actually like band together and bounce ideas off of each other. And so some people will tell you that's kind of like a personal board, but I will certainly say for, big decisions and small, but largely the big ones, I have, a set of friends that I would certainly look to, all of whom I think are incredible women who kind of see the world differently than I will. And in some ways they'll bully me and tell me that I'm being stupid on one thing and other things be incredibly encouraging. And I think it's really important to just kind of have that as you go. And again, everyone has friends that you'll go to for different decisions. So one on jobs, others on personal, but just like building that bench, I think is really important.
I mean, it's sort of a loaded question, but do you think, should you modify your behavior towards quote unquote masculine qualities, particularly in sales? There's these stereotypes about, even though they've largely been debunked because it's sort of been shown that introverts or at least ambiverts are probably more successful in sales than sort of typically or stereotypically defined extroverts. But have you found yourself or do you find yourself embracing certain elements of your personality or modifying your personality based on gender roles as you look for success, or you completely you're ignoring all of those things and just trying to do your best and et cetera.
Yeah, some of it I think may even be like, I actually don't even know, right? So I could probably potentially be like more intense or something in a meeting that I actually have no idea. I will say at Revenue Collective dinners, my volume level does go up a notch or two. So maybe that's the most that's the most reflective of me trying to fit in with the greater team. But I think I think this is going to be easier said than done. But I think in the end, like there is only so much you can do to kind of like trick an environment into a personality. I think like it's exhausting. And so some people may have been full masters of it, and I give total credence to there is a whole host of people who have done that and like I think sacrificed either personality wise or disguised truly who they were to bring us to where we are in time. That said, I think we are also coming to a moment where the acknowledgement and the acceptance is that actually it's exhausting to pretend like you're somebody else. And I think actually, Harvard did a study that actually like the productivity gain that's lost out of pretending not to be yourself actually is terrible and very impactful. So if you can think about what unlocks if you actually are just like your true self. And so I'd like to be fairly optimistic about it, that we're in a moment where people actually can be their true selves and don't need to modify. But I think probably classically there's a little bit of just like mirroring, but for the most part, again, I don't think you can like trick people. What I say, like you can't trick people into dating you. You are who you are. And I think that's kind of true in all things.
Yeah. Makes a lot of sense. So we're almost at the end of our time together. This has obviously been a fascinating conversation because you're doing something so innovative within this broader context. When you think about one of the things that we like to do in the podcast is sort of pay it forward and talk about people that have influenced you. So who are some of the people that you think we should know about that are great sales or marketing leaders or just great executives that have been role models for you over the last couple of years?
Yeah. So on that one, I'd say hands down, it's pretty easy. It's my former boss, Nicola Mendelsohn, who runs Facebook's business in EMEA. And I think for that, actually, the most incredible thing is like, I think she's the one who actually taught me that you like can bring like literally be your whole person. And so Nicola is an incredible visionary, a sales leader. And I think that said also has like taught me the importance of what it means to like actually fundamentally have people at the core. And so she's always the person who like, no matter how hectic things seem or intense, like will literally take the 10 minutes and like thinks that actually it's a failing of a professional relationship if you don't know what's going on in that person's personal life. She's like, how can you possibly like work with this person, understand what drives them and makes them tick if you don't know what's going on like under the hood, so to speak. And I think the other thing around that is actually, for Nicola, like she has 4 children and has basically like, prioritized that. She worked 4-day weeks for a number of years because she had 4 young, small children. And she basically like, went to her bosses one day and was like, look, like I basically could just use 1 extra day. I feel like I'm not doing very well at the mom thing and the work thing. And I would really like just benefit from that 1 day. And I think that's an incredible role model and an incredible just way to be like, look, like I can see a system that would work better for me and I just need like your support to make that happen. And obviously she had incredible people around her to make that happen. But I think just like the boldness to kind of like know what you need and then actually just vocalize it. I mean, I think that's half the battle. So I think she's been truly inspirational and formative for me.
That's awesome. Well, I'm definitely going to look her up. I hadn't heard of her before. When you think about, you just mentioned you're downloading all these books off of Amazon. And so what are some of the books that you've been reading that have had an impact on you that we can sort of follow the breadcrumb trail and get some good insights from?
Oh my God, this is so embarrassing. I'm reading everything from like the challenger sale to the challenger customer to fanatical prospecting to predictable prospecting. And the most hilarious thing about fanatical prospecting, hat tip to Jeb Blount, is basically like he'll still say things like, the difference in sales between wearing like a Rolex and a Timex is prospecting. And you're like, this is amazing. When was this book written? It was written in like 2016, 2017. So it's not like it was written in 1982. But then he's absolutely right. It's like, people who are like, oh, I forgot to prospect. And then that's where you are. And so I think there's a bunch of books like that. And then obviously, there's the kind of classic like B2B enterprise ones. And so, again, the Aaron Ross pantheon. And then there's just like a ton of ones that I'm reading, like, the talent code, culture code, Dan Coyle of like what it means to be high performing teams. And so stuff like that I think is also super helpful. Just like, again, like in the end, people are people. And so there's something behind them that makes them tick. And you're all the better for it if everyone can have an open conversation and get to what that is.
So fanatical prospecting is the one that you just mentioned.
Yes.
Why are you laughing? I'm going to look it up.
because somehow this is going to like come back to me where I'm like, I thought it was hilarious. The difference between like driving, this car and that car comes down to prospecting. But I guess, at the core of it, it's probably true.
Well, I guess it's about goal setting and about doing stuff that you don't feel like doing. And, who doesn't want a Rolex?
Although, absolutely.
I used to want a Rolex, but then I got an Apple Watch. And the problem is that a Rolex couldn't do like my heart rate and calorie counting and all that other exercise stuff. So I'm like, I don't really even know if I'd ever wear it if I had one.
So there you go. Apple solved your entire problem.
Yeah, exactly. And totally lowered my expectations for myself. Now I don't need a $20,000 watch. Diane, I assume you guys are growing or hiring, or if people out there are hearing this and, they want to get in touch with you, maybe they want to have a coffee with you, or they want to apply for a job at Facebook. Are you okay with listeners reaching out to you, and what's your preferred mechanism, if so?
Yeah, of course. So probably I think the best bet would to be email me directly. It's Diane Chang, DianeChang at fb.com. And so, postings on our website, we keep fairly up to date. And so that would be your best bet to see if there's an opening. But we're excited to grow this team.
Awesome. Diane, thanks so much for joining us on the podcast, and I'll see you very soon.
Thanks so much. It's been so nice to be here.
Bye.
Bye.
Hey folks, this is Sam's Corner. Really enjoyed that conversation with Diane Chang from Facebook. Diane walked through a lot of different frameworks, and a couple of them are really just about agency in your life. And I think it's an important mindset. She talked about this concept of the protagonist framework. If you're late, don't say it was because of the train. How many people have heard that in their lives when somebody's rolling into a meeting 5 minutes late? And they're always blaming public transportation. And instead of doing that, flip that on its head and say, you know what, I could have left 5 minutes earlier. It's about taking accountability and responsibility, which in the moment may feel like you're punishing yourself, but in the long term, what it does is give you back control over your life. The other thing that she mentioned is, and other people of the podcast have mentioned it, if you see an opportunity, don't sort of self-monitor yourself. If you don't ask, you can't get, right? So if you think that you're a good candidate for a potential role, why don't you raise your hand and lean in, especially if you're a woman, I have to say, because when they've done gender studies, sometimes it is women who are a little bit more reserved, who are calibrating their expertise relative to the role in a more measured way. And you don't have to do that. If you think that you can contribute, get out of your comfort zone and go for that role, go for that opportunity, particularly if it lines up with your career ambitions. And that's the final part of Diane's message that I think is really important. She said every 5 to 10 years, figure out your why, figure out what is your true motivation, and go 5 layers deep. She said, get a friend that can keep saying why. Why do you want to do that? Why is that motivating to you? And I think that that's really, really important. And I've done that recently for myself, just figuring out what gets me out of bed every day, and why do I want to exist besides just making lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of money, which of course I want to do, but it's not really about that. For me, it's about helping other people, and it really is about helping people that in particular that I respect, that take agency and work their asses off. Those are the people I want to see if I can accelerate their careers in some way, give them a boost, and help them achieve their goals. And that's why I started the Revenue Collective, for that exact purpose. And that came out of an exercise of self-reflection and actually working with a personal coach. So figure out what motivates you and use that to set 5 and 10-year goals, which is also a lesson that Danny Hertzberg from Slack has also mentioned on the podcast. Now, before we go, we want to give a shout out to our sponsors before we part. AirCall, your advanced call center software, complete business phone and contact center, 100% natively integrated into any CRM, and Outreach, a customer engagement platform that helps efficiently and effectively engage prospects to drive more pipeline and close more deals. You'll find this podcast on iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, or anywhere that you enjoy your podcasts. And if you enjoy this episode, please share with your peers on LinkedIn, Twitter. Share it on your internal company Slack. That's a new request. Put that out there in sort of the general channel, but tell people about it, because that's what keeps us on the air, and that's what helps us bring great content and great guests. And if you want to get in touch with me, find me on Twitter or find me on LinkedIn. LinkedIn's probably better for professional correspondence. That's linkedin.com/in and then /Sam F. Jacobs, or you can just Google Sam Jacobs Behavox and I will show up. So thanks for listening. We will talk to you next time, and hope you had a great new year.